Welcome to another episode of Poetic Lines. I'm your host, Elizabeth Lund. Today, my guest is January Gill O'Neil, author of the new book Glitter Road, which brings readers from the Northeast to the Deep South, from present day to the ghosts of history, and from old love to new beginnings. The poems in Glitter Road, as one writer has noted, move seamlessly from Tina Turner to the legacy of Emmett Till to cartwheels and more. Along the way, the work considers Blackness, family, loss, and some ugly truths about the nation's past, yet also leaves room for hope. January Gill O'Neil is an associate professor at Salem State University and the author of 3 other poetry collections, all published by Cabin Cary Press. From 2012 to 2018, she served as the executive director of the Massachusetts Poetry Festival. Her poems and articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, American Poetry Review, Poetry, and Sierra Magazine, among others. Her poem at the rededication of the Emmett Till Memorial was the co-winner of the 2022 Allen Ginsberg Poetry Award from the Poetry Center at Passaic County Community College. The recipient of fellowships from Cave Canon and the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, O'Neil was the 2019-2020 John and Renee Grisham Writer-in-Residence at the University of Mississippi, Oxford. She currently serves as the 2022 through 2024 board chair of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. I'm delighted to have January here today to talk about facing the past and the future. January, welcome to the show. It's so good to see you again.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good to see you too.
Your book is stunning. Would you tell us a little bit about how the poems came to be and then read a poem for us?
Sure. My book is Glitter Road, and it is a book that I wrote when I was in Mississippi with my children as the John and Renee Grisham Fellow at the University of Mississippi, Oxford. So we went down in August of 2019. My kids were teens at the time, so I had to pull them out of one high school and put them in another. But it was an opportunity really to teach one class a semester and to focus on writing. And they gave us a space and the time to really imagine just a different lifestyle for a while. It also gave me the opportunity to explore the landscape and the history of Mississippi. I'm from Virginia and living in Massachusetts probably for more than 25 years, but I'm still a Southern girl at heart. But to go down to Mississippi is really, that is the South, that is the Deep South. And so it was an education. And for me, I really grappled with the legacy of slavery. I could feel it in the landscape. I feel that trauma that's still there. It gave me a chance to explore Emmett Till and his legacy. Emmett Till being a 14-year-old boy who was beaten, shot, thrown into the Tallahatchie for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His body floated downriver and was pulled out. And before we went to Mississippi, there was a news story that went viral about these 3 Old Miss students who had stood next to the marker and posed, and the sign was full of bullet holes. That went viral. And so that and a few other things made us wonder, oh, what are we stepping into? But I value that time that I had in Mississippi. There are good people everywhere, people trying to do the right thing. And even though it's still a bit of a one-party state, I learned so much about myself, the landscape, the people, the culture, the environment. I mean, I wish everybody had the chance to sort of leave their life for a little bit and then come back to it. So it's okay with you? I'd like to read a poem.
Yes, please.
Okay. This first poem is called Low Delta Country. Driving along Highway 6, I'm not sure where the towns begin and end. Heavy trees lean ground close, choked by kudzu. Roots growing over enslaved land, wild daffodils sprouting across long demolished plantations and working farms. plots pocked with mostly unmarked graves. I should have chased that laughter at the gas station and said hello to whoever stood there, but had nowhere else to go but inside. Only towns, like only children, carry the loneliness of broken windows in their eyes. They disappear when the buzzards stop their soar over shorn fields, give up mid-air, and drop like a wine bottle. Goldenrod, deer bones, billboards for now defunct businesses in the town's one strip mall. Maybe some places should rewild. In the land of John Deere, machines pick clean what the enslaved did by hand. Irrigation rigs, big as pterodactyls, sit idle after the harvest. Tufts of cotton fleck the landscape like cheap insulation.
That is such a striking poem. It prepares readers for the journey we're about to take with you, and it really puts us in the moment.
Mm.
And it highlights all of the contradictions in that place you're describing. Was it difficult to balance some of the contradictions and the images?
At times it was, and I'm thankful that I'm a writer and I get to process that in between space, that perhaps, maybe, that wonderment. I cherish that. Big contradictions in Mississippi. Oxford, Mississippi has the college, the university as its main driver. And it is a beautiful city, a city just like most cities. I mean, it has a rich arts culture, lots of great food, a storied history. Faulkner is from lived there. There's a certain amount of wealth and class there. Go 5 miles outside and, some desolate, remote spots. Go down into the Delta. There are places where population 200, population 1,000. And so that was something I was trying to capture, like moving from one space into another. And as I get more comfortable with the book and look at these poems collectively, there's a lot of transitions in this book. So movement from one place to another, the river or rivers coming into this book. I was thinking I've got the Tallahatchie, I've got the Mississippi River, and the Hoosick River. So I'm trying to cover as many landscapes as I can.
The book does a beautiful job of covering those landscapes and weaving in all of the transitions that you just mentioned.
Hmm.
When you were writing the poems, was it difficult to process a lot of what you were taking in? Because as you said, the poems do balance in that sort of in-between space.
Mhm.
Was
Mhm.
that a challenge?
Yes, but a good challenge. I was there for 9 months. I had time to process. I didn't want to write anything that made me feel like a visitor or somebody who was just stopping in. I really embedded myself, and I go back to Mississippi, so it's a part of me now. Oh, it was challenging, sort of doing a deep dive and knowing, for instance, that University of Mississippi at one point was a hospital in the Civil War. But what I do love about the campus is that they recognize that. They don't hide it, they own up to it. It is not a perfect place. In some respects, I think Mississippi is a little more out front about race relations and their past. And in other respects, it is difficult. There are a class of people who are doing really well and a pretty wide gap in the people who aren't. That part was hard to wrestle with. But I feel really good about the poems in this book, about talking about Emmett Till and making them a touch point for people who want to really sort of dive into race. I want to connect the past to the present and to say these things happen. What happened back then is just happening now, and we have cameras to, document all this stuff. So literature gives us another way to reflect, to share, to honor the past, to tell these stories that would get lost. And honestly, that was part of the making of the book, going to these places where some Civil War memorials, Emmett Till spots where the main drivers of his story happened, going, reflecting upon those moments, drawing those connections. It's different than just opening a book and saying, I want to write about Emmett Till, but going down there and being part of the landscape. I didn't know that's what I would end up writing, but going and being open to new opportunities and just finding the connections. That was a truly rewarding part of travel. And I feel very lucky that I had the opportunity to go.
I'm glad that you did have the opportunity to go there because the poems come across not as written by someone who is visiting, but by someone who did really insert herself into the landscape and is a very wise guide, pointing out things that readers might not notice on their own.
Yeah, thank you. I try to add as much detail as I can without turning those details so much into facts or exposition. I mean, I'm always conscious that I'm writing a poem. But even when I was working on this book, we went to the rededication ceremony for the Emmett Till Memorial, for instance. And I didn't, the next day turn around and write that poem. I took notes and I put it away and I did other things. I got my kids settled and figured out my teaching schedule and met people and explored. I was there August 2019 and then COVID hit March of 20. That's about when we went into isolation and seclusion. That's when I started to unpack all the stuff. Many of us had the time. I certainly did. And living where we were in Mississippi, it was a little isolating. It was a very big property on the edge of town. And so we didn't have the distractions of walking out and there's a shopping plaza or a coffee shop. You really did. If you were leaving, you needed to be purposeful about why you were leaving. It was a good opportunity to sit and reflect and have, time to write those poems. But I didn't write those poems the moment that they happened. I needed some distance. I needed to process in ways, I can only look back and understand that thread. Actual distance and then emotional distance from the work and what I was taking in.
That emotional distance allows the poems to feel vibrant and intimate and very emotionally connected,
Mm.
which is powerful for readers because you allow us to have a very deep experience that we would not have if you hadn't found both the distance and the intimacy in those details.
Thank you. It's hard to know all that when you're writing. I'm just trying to write poems that please myself. But as somebody who reads a lot of poetry, I want to feel something. I don't want to just view it. I want to be a part of it. I want to come out of these poems a little changed. I know that as a writer, but as a reader of poetry, I want to feel, I want to have some kind of a moment of transition. And so that's what I hope the readers get. That's what I strive to do in my work always.
This reader certainly gets all of that from your work. Would you read another poem for us?
Would love to. I'll read another Mississippi poem. Not all the poems are Mississippi poems. This is a poem I wrote about the time I started to, go into the Delta and explore. My kids were in school, so I go down by myself. And, it was a terrific experience to do that, just to sort of have this time and space. But I was also a little nervous being a woman traveling to a different part of the state, not many people knowing where I am, where the GPS and Wi-Fi were faulty. So I think about that in the background of this poem. On the edge of a field in Sumner, Mississippi, I picked cotton with my bare hands in the town where Emmett Till's killers were acquitted in 1955 at the bottomlands fed by the swollen Tallahatchie. History of the last empire explained in its dreamy white bowls. Cash crop so valuable that plantation owners burned it by the bale to keep it out of Union hands. And I can't help but think about the Negro hands, cracked and worn, twisting the lock from the burr, stripping the stalk from top to bottom, the hard ground broken against weather and weevils. Their lives tied to a parcel of land. Children younger than my own, working from can to can't see under a blistering sun, hungry, half paid, or nothing. The debts they would die with. Everything weighed down to the fiber, everything done by hand. I break off a branch to feel trauma in my hands, a reminder that I have risked so little to be here, not even the shirt off my back. Okay. That was the first time I had ever seen a real cotton field. And just to imagine, when I say trauma of the land, boy, I felt it there. To just to sort of walk around that space and be like, wow, all this cotton was done by hand from morning to night, from can to can't see.
That poem is stunning and it's haunting because it makes you feel the weight of all of those generations who were forced to pick cotton. And I can feel the cotton ball in my hand.
And when I think about my last line, really there's something about, like, I'm standing here and I'm wearing a cotton shirt in front of a cotton field, and like we don't ever really process where our materials come from or how it gets into our hands or our bodies. And so I was also trying to make that connection at the end.
You mentioned earlier that literature allows us to process
Mm-hmm.
experiences and events. Can you talk a little bit about how poetry, the act of writing poems, helped you process all of the things you describe in the book?
But the act of writing really does feel like taking pictures. I think of poetry as like snapshots. Like, this is what happened from one perspective in my life. And so if you were to ask somebody else about the same moment, they would have a different perspective. But this is my story, my first person perspective. I am in most of my poems. I know some people are more comfortable writing in third person, but I feel like if I need to have that connection. And so I'm conscious about where the I is always in the writing. And maybe that makes me sort of that willing participant to show you as a reader what's happening, so that you have a sense of what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, and how I'm involving all of the senses in the process.
Absolutely. You do put me into all of the different scenes you describe, into all of the different images. And because you do that, I feel those things, I experience them, and I am changed by reading the work.
Hmm. Well, that's all a poet can hope for. So thank you.
Would you read another poem for us?
Sure. Sure. I think I'm going to shift a little bit, and I was reflecting upon my boyfriend who I met down there, and Mississippi is just full of wonder and amazement for me. And a good portion, of it is due to him, and the whole idea about being open. And I had not been in a relationship in a very long time. So I really do look at these poems as snapshots and where I was at a particular time. And so it's nice to be able to write about love in a real way. Mississippi season. He says I hold my mind well, likes that I put my kids first and have never tried drugs. The lilt in his southern drawl intoxicates me. He likes not being able to have all of me, makes him want me more. Broken finds broken, I say. So when he kisses my neck, along my clavicle, down to my breast, I break all over again after a drought of no kissing, no touch. How not being chosen can dim any light. For years, I told myself a story I could live with, thought of myself a kind of carnival fish in a plastic bag, floating in my own still water, waiting to be loved. Dumb luck that someone flips a red ring on the mouth of a glass jar, and just like that, I am kissing again, kissing a man so luminous, so beautifully flawed, I can barely look at him. And my mind, done with all its stories, turns to the carnal as I rim the hinge of his lips with my tongue and dive into this quenching. For folks on the North Shore and Massachusetts residents, we have something up here called the Topsfield Fair. And so, for whatever reason, when I was writing that poem, the whole idea of being a fish at a carnival, floating in bags of still water, throwing a red rim on bottles, that actually is like a Topsfield Fair thing, where like a carnival fair where you're just flipping a red ring on a bottle and win a prize. And so that was the image that popped into that poem. And sometimes with poetry, I like fitting in two things that shouldn't really be together and melding them together and see, from a craft standpoint, if I can make it work. And I hope it works in that poem.
Oh, it does, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because that image is so evocative for anyone who has had a drought so to speak,
Right.
in romance, and you can feel how you felt. You can also sense the excitement and the hope of this new relationship. And
Yeah.
when I look at the book, one of the things I like about the love poems is that they do show us a journey of another kind. And they also suggest in a very subtle way, at least for me, that there can be new beginnings. And I
Mm.
like that idea, especially when I think about some of the other threads in the book, that if there can be hope for someone, if you can learn to love again, then maybe we as a culture can begin to appreciate each other.
I hope if poetry can even do that a little bit. I mean, don't we need more love and understanding in the world these days? I mean, wow. I mean, maybe my book's a little bit of that, but like overall, I think poetry is just waiting for readers to open up and share their experiences and have a touch point and say, this is how I got through it. I think poetry can give readers a lot of that.
I agree with you. And I think many people want poems to help them feel again, help them feel the possibility of change. Because as you said, we desperately need that
Mhm.
these days. And poetry is unique in its ability to help us feel that kind of transition. But it also becomes a bridge for understanding, a bridge for communication, especially with the kind of poems that you have written in this
Mm.
book.
Again, that's the hope, and I never sit down and think, "Oh, well, what are my poems gonna do today?" I'm my first best reader, so I have to be happy with it. Like many writers, like you, Elizabeth. I mean, we don't put anything out there that we're not happy with.
Your work has always been so clear-eyed about losses and injustices, yet you also always seem to find a glimmer of hope. You leave readers with
Mhm,
the feeling that things can change.
mhm.
Was that harder to do in this collection?
I don't think it was harder, but it was very important that the idea of Black joy, joy in general, but Black joy in particular, when talking about the difficulties in Mississippi and in Till, and talking about Black women, it was really important to stress that we have these complicated lives. And so we have to celebrate the and cherish those wonderful moments as well as point out and make center stage some of the more difficult ones. It's not easy. It's not easy for anyone. But I always come back to joy. And maybe that's the theme in all of the books, even the tougher ones. I always come back to joy.
That's beautiful. Could you say a little bit more about why joy is so important? Is it a perspective that we need to have? Does it give us access to parts of ourselves that we wouldn't be able to access otherwise?
Think that's key. It's the flip side of pain. And how can you really appreciate life in its fullest if you don't recognize that times are hard? And in my work, I really like that gray area. I like that in between, again, the wonderment, the speculation, the what if, the possibility. What if things go wrong? What if there was another way to do this? What if he doesn't call? What if my
Okay.
kids go in a crazy direction? Like all of that stuff has entered in my poems over time. But I always seem to land on joy. I don't think we talk about joy enough. Right word. It's necessary to talk about pain. There are a lot of voices that have not been heard. And I think in this century, there's been more of an opportunity. Maybe social media has helped with that. We've gone through different periods where we wanted to hear from the diversity of voices that are out there, and those stories aren't easy. And so there's been a lot of opportunity to talk about some of the pain and hardships and traumas that are out there. But I also feel like I'm standing over here on the side saying, let's talk about joy too. There's wonderment and nature and connection and community and all these things that make up a life that we can't forget about, that we have to include in the narrative. I would hate for somebody in 100 years to look back on this time and all they saw was disarray, discontentment, inability to communicate. I mean, there is that, but there's so much more to our world, that so many more stories that need to be told. And if we don't tell them, those stories disappear. They fade into history. Till's story is long is bigger than anything I write, and there will be people writing about that um, as time goes on. I'm just happy to contribute. And along with some of those painful moments, there is joy.
That was a gorgeous answer. And I agree with you about the need to see something other than the disarray of our time, because if we only focus on that, there's no real way out of it.
Right, right. I mean, we need each other. And, we are going to go through painful moments. So we have to stop and recognize that, these small, quiet, simple moments matter. I think that's why people come to poetry. Sure, we need poetry when there is a birth or a death, a wedding, a funeral. We need them for those big moments, but it's also, I'm, picking up the phone and talking to my mother and talking about what she's doing in her day and how ordinary it is, or me taking the dog for a walk, or, sometimes we just want to empathize. Sometimes we want something that helps us understand how we're feeling right now in those moments when we think no one feels like I do in this moment. We want to write poetry to fill the cracks in those moments.
Beautifully said. There are so many wonderful connections in this book, so many journeys, so many possibilities. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about the work.
Oh, thank you.
In the last few months, you have given many readings from this book. What are some of the things listeners have told you that have surprised or delighted you?
I feel really lucky about this book that's been well received. Sometimes people come up with me, like sometimes I'll read the poems about divorce, which are more in the beginning of the book, and that's always surprising that they can relate or that they can appreciate those. The love poems, people really seem to like, and of course, the Emmett Till poems. I've had conversations about Emmett Till in group settings, and that's been difficult and rewarding. And I feel like if it's an opportunity to talk about race in these fraught times, I'd rather somebody talk to me than go on the internet and make up their own theories. So we need more opportunities for discussion. I think that's what poetry opens up people for.
I love the fact that you remind us of the importance of joy, the importance of possibilities. Thank you for the poems and for what you've shared here and for everything you do to help people discover poetry and to discover the better parts of themselves.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching Poetic Lines. If you enjoyed this episode, come back next month for another in-depth conversation about the power and delight of language and how poetry can enhance people's lives. Have an idea about a possible topic or guest? Send me a message through my website, poeticlines.net.